This is the first of a short presentation on the history of photography from 1839 to 1980 to familiarize you with the early inventors, I guess, if you will, or certainly those who experimented to make the medium what we know today. There's a wonderful book, which is really an essay. It's called Before Photography by Peter Galassi, and he starts with with an interesting statement in that he's basically saying that perhaps the most curious aspect of this race of the invention of photography was really not a race at all until the actual discovery, if you will, was announced by Daguerre in 1839, because in reality, with the exception of Niepce, there was quite a few other inventors or experimenter scientists that were dabbing with the idea of fixing the image with light or making an image with silver, and none of them were really aware of the other until the invention was actually announced by Louis Daguerre. So one of them, Thomas Wedgwood, is credited of being the first to actually try to get an image made out of light on a silver compound. He was never successful in fixing the image, and he became ill before his experiments were actually totally realized. Niepce, of course, is the one that we often know of. When we think of the invention of photography, we often think right away of Niepce and Daguerre. Of course, Daguerre being the creator, if you will, of the daguerreotype. But Niepce was actually the first that we know of that was successfully able to fix the image, the image that was made by light onto actually the paper. At the same time, though, William Fox Talbot, very close in the years in terms of the experimentation, he was also very successful in fixing the image. And he ran to kind of announce his invention once he saw the invention of Daguerre that was published. And of course, Daguerre, in a sense, took all the credit in 1839. Not that, of course, he shouldn't have had some credit. He certainly perfected a lot of what Niepce and Talbot were actually working on. So the invention of photography basically is dependent on two things. The first being optical, which is the idea that through a small aperture in the wall of a dark room, the image on the other side will actually project on the opposite wall, and it will project upside down. The second principle is of course chemical, and Johann Heinrich Schultz is really responsible in 1727 in proving that silver halides turn dark when exposed to light. So we look at the origins of photography, and if we look back before these men, before we can really define photography as a way of actually having light paint an image and fixing it on some type of surface, whether paper or tin or whatever the case may be. The origins of photography and this idea of the camera obscura, the camera lucida, can really be traced to the Renaissance period, to the 15th century. And it was a time when the idea of linear perspective was really brought to light by artists like Alberti, who mathematically kind of wrote and documented, how do we make a three-dimensional space and document it in a two-dimensional plane of a piece of paper or a painting. And these artists were very avid and enthusiastic, about making these theories and these kinds of, I suppose, formulas, if you will, available to all artists, so that this whole penetration of space, that if you look at a canvas, you feel like you're walking into an actual three-dimensional space. That was really important to them, and very much they succeeded. So Alberti also, and you could see how these early sketches and drawings of both their architectural renderings and of course their paintings would be something of value. So Filippo Brunelleschi. And these artists then began to use the camera obscura and the camera lucida later on. So the camera obscura, basically being a dark room, was really not that useful in a sense, because you have this room and you have the pinhole, but all you could really see is what's on the other side. So if you wanted to do a whole landscape, if you wanted to do a different street, and you wanted to render this or study it as how could it be rendered in a three-dimensional space, then of course you really couldn't transport this whole room. But little by little, devices began to be made, and these artists then began to use more of what becomes known as the camera lucida, which is a much more transportable device, in which you can actually carry this little box. And Bramante and these artists were the camera, the smaller version of the camera obscura, actually allowed you to look at the scene that you were facing, and there was a glass in which you were actually able to trace or study the reflected scene as you did it. So the origins of the camera obscura, camera being room, actually, it's an Italian phrase, and camera in Italian is room, and it's actually kind of, it's a funny story that I'll share with you. The first time I was in Italy, of course I had my camera, and I figured, well, camera should be a camera, right? And the camera obscura is, I kind of thought, well, maybe that's where the name comes from, which of course it is inspired by. But in a sense, if you ask for a camera in Italy, they point you to a hotel, because you want a bed. That's basically what they're saying. You want a room. The actual phrase in Italian for a camera, as we know it in English, is macchina fotografica. So it's just an interesting thing. And of course, obscura, meaning dark. So the actual term camera obscura really means dark room, which is our traditional dark room for enlarging and printing a film. So, as I mentioned, this is more of an illustration to the principle of the camera, light entering a tiny hole, and it's projected, as you see in this illustration. And then, of course, the actual dark room as it was built. And Giovanni Battista della Porta, in his book Natural Magic in 1553, really actually writes about this camera obscura as an aid to drawing. So it's actually, when you think about it, 1553, and then it wasn't until 1839, 1835, 1827, however we want to date it in exactitude, that experimenters and scientists and innovators, I guess inventors, really figured out how to make this image from light. Here's a few examples of the 17th and 18th century models. As you can see how it advances, they try to make them more and more practical for artists. Now, this is not to say that every artist of the 17th and 18th century now started copying and tracing, and maybe you might want to question their ability. It really so much wasn't about that. It was, I want to say, defended more as a tool of observation, right? A tool of studying. And yes, some did trace it because it made mechanical reproduction so much more effective or practical, I suppose, for the period. In 1727, in the Academy of Natural Philosophers publication, a man named Johann Heinrich Schultz actually writes about the sensitive compound, which he calls scatophoros, translated to the bringer of darkness. And this is basically, the idea that silver halides, are sensitive to light. And there was a great need, during this time to make reproductions in great quantity. Illustrated publications were a great demand, and people, so many people wanted their portraits. Of course, they wanted to be remembered, and many people just simply couldn't afford the great painters and artists of the time. So as the camera obscura becomes more and more practical, then in 1807, scientists, as the same thing that happens today, right? The larger cameras eventually became smaller and smaller and smaller, and we'll see that at the end of this illustrated lecture. So in 1807, Wollaston designs what we call the camera lucida, which is really this little optical device that allows you, to look at something and trace it, which is kind of interesting. Beaumont Newhall, in his wonderful and very classic book called The History of Photography, has a quote, and what he's quoting: the fever of reality was running high. Very, very romantic, kind of comment with that. The physical aid of the camera obscura and the camera lucida had drawn men so near to an exact copying of nature, and to satisfy that current craving, now what they really wanted to do, basically, is forget the pencil, how can I get this image on this piece of paper, and how can light make that image? And I think the excitement of that is what got, so many people to experiment. And of course, what we consider the first photograph, it's really the first surviving photograph, around 1817, is successfully created by a man, Joseph Nicephore Niepce. And it's a view from his window, the window of his estate at La Grasse, and it's the first surviving photograph. Niepce had discovered this bitumen of Judea, which was a solution that hardened, and it hardened, and some of it was insoluble in a lavender oil, and he was able to figure out how to fix this image. Interestingly enough, this image is said to have taken about 8 hours. So of course the exposure times for the early practitioners were quite long. They weren't fractions of seconds, though they came to be fractions of seconds, surprisingly quick, as we'll see in a little bit. In a visit to his brother, Niepce stopped at Paris. He was going to London to visit his brother. And he stopped at a studio of a painter, of a man who actually painted dioramas for the theater. And he stopped there because he had discovered or heard that Louis Daguerre was also experimenting with photosensitive types of materials, and had somewhat been successful in fixing the image. And the two men ended up working together. They ended up forming a partnership, and they signed a contractual agreement actually that lasted about 4 years. It was supposed to last 10, but unfortunately Niepce actually passed on 4 years after they started to work together. In 1837, Daguerre, of course, continues to do the work after Niepce passes on, and he succeeds in making the earliest surviving example of what we later call the daguerreotype. And this is the actual image. It's a still life of plaster casts, a wicker bottle. You see the curtains, the framed picture, and it's actually the first, again, surviving image to be fully detailed. That shows a wide range of tones, and Daguerre calls this the daguerreotype, and it's announced publicly in France as this great invention. And this is a quote from the Gazette de France. I'll give you a little chance to read it. So Daguerre, as you can imagine, was very excited about this. He basically, takes credit for the invention. Of course, now we know that there are many people that need to have the credit for the development of photography. It's difficult to. We can certainly give Daguerre the credit for developing the daguerreotype, but we certainly can't give him the credit for inventing photography. So the first daguerreotypes were mainly of architecture, and mostly because, again, the exposures were rather long. Though quickly, from 8 hours, quickly they were able to be down to minutes because of the developments of the emulsion of the silver, etc. And some of these are interesting. So it's mostly because, the exposure times were so long that people could not be recorded. Here's some other interesting daguerreotypes that were made. Interestingly enough, in England, William Fox Talbot was also developing shadographs and the types of images. This is a little image of Talbot's camera from 1835. And Talbot, his contributions were the fact that he did figure out a way of fixing the image with salt. It wasn't very permanent, but one of his greatest contributions is that he figured out or realized that this negative image that his camera would make, if it was made on a fairly transparent paper, could actually be flipped again, re-exposed to make a positive. So this contribution is really incredible in the sense that now you have reproducibility of the image. So Talbot not only found a way of fixing the image, even though it was not permanent, it was stayed long enough for him to be able to reverse it into a positive. In 1841, he actually wrote down and he developed this whole procedure, and he named it the calotype. And his book, The Pencil of Nature, was the first publication of photographs. I think I have a slide with that coming. Just a little tiny picture, as you can see. It's really difficult to make out, but it's the earliest surviving photograph with the camera obscura made by Talbot. I believe it's in the Museum of Science in London, and it was made in 1835. Here's a close-up of it. And The Pencil of Nature, it's probably one of the most famous publications in the history of photography by Talbot. And it is so because it was published in 1844 in London, and it is in fact the first illustrated book that has been illustrated by photographs. Interestingly enough, this is a spread of the inside of it. The New York Public Library actually has a copy, but no one's allowed to see it because it's fading so quickly. The Gutenberg organization actually has an entire ebook of The Pencil of Nature, and this is the link if you're interested. It would be worth your while to look at it. So by the end of the 1840, it's important to note that 3 technical advances had been made that made it possible to cut exposure times drastically: an improved lens, light sensitivity of plates, for recoating iodized surface with other halogens. So the plates themselves, this is the beginning of what we call the speed of film, right? The ISO, how quickly does the film actually make an exposure. And then the tones were enriched by gilding the plate with gold. So that was pretty interesting as well. These advances, opened the way for portrait studios. And this was just really a huge phenomenon in Europe, in America, and of course, especially in the great cities like New York. Here's a portrait of young Lincoln, and of course of Frederick Douglass that were both made in New York. So in America, it was actually recorded by the state of Massachusetts that 403,626 daguerreotypes had been taken in the year 1855 alone. A New York gallery also boasted the production of 300 to 1,000 portraits a day. This is a little illustration of what Matthew Brady's portrait gallery in New York City would have looked like. The Matthew Brady being one of the most famous photographers in America in the history of photography, who of course embarked upon actually documenting the Civil War. That whole lecture in and of itself, about that, but very interesting in and of itself, of course. In 1851, Frederick Scott Archer develops the collodion process. And these plates, which is basically a wet plate, literally dominate the photography world until 1880. It's important to note that, the early photographers, for example, like Matthew Brady, when he goes around to document the Civil War, he actually had to travel around with a darkroom. It was that he would have to coat the plates, the wet collodion plates, and then he would put them in the camera to expose them, and then he would actually have to develop them. So it was quite a task to do that. Often, I know I whine because I'm carrying my camera bag, with 3 lenses, and it really it makes me think about what am I whining about when these men and women actually carried such exact ridiculous kinds of equipment with them. So here's a little illustration of what it actually took. So the photographer would have to polish the plate. You would coat the plate, and then of course you would expose it and then develop it. Finally, the shutters were improved, and in 1869, Edward Muybridge, which is another very famous person in the history of photography, invents one of the first shutters for the camera, and he begins this his really a lifelong devotion to the study of movement. Very famous, many books by Muybridge published, many exhibitions in the studies of movement, and his photographs, have a tremendous impact even with artists and painters and scientists, because they actually can really see, for example, like how does a horse gallop? What is the position of the legs? And these are things were kind of imagined and assumed by human beings prior to this documentation. But now you could actually see how a bird moves, and how people move, and the documentation was really very worthwhile in a scientific perspective. As we move on, inventions between 1850 and 1880, I've given you a link on the accompanying PDF that goes with this lecture that gives you very long explanations of the very famous processes. I think it's important when you go to museums to be educated and look at an image, and if it says an albumin process, and you can say, oh, that means that the emulsion was mixed with egg whites, and that's an important thing to know. And carbon prints, for example, developed by Poitevin, were carbon pigments were actually, put into the emulsion. And ambrotype was really just a direct collodion process, positive, and tintypes, which were a cheaper alternative, I guess one could say, to daguerreotypes, because they were just tin plates that were polished with a black lacquer, and that became the production of these images was, and then of course coated with emulsion, was very, very cheap. The really huge impact, on the plates and what would actually start to lead to the idea of film is in 1871 when Richard Leach Maddox basically develops the gelatin silver plate. And the gelatin silver plate becomes a huge advancement because now manufacturers, begin to produce these plates, and they're basically coating paper with gelatin emulsion, and the idea of reproducibility of printing on paper begins to give birth, right? Advances in lenses, shutters, cameras, and designs, and the speed of the emulsion, as we mentioned earlier. And of course, then the very famous George Eastman. Once these plates are being manufactured, George Eastman was actually a plate maker, a plate manufacturer. He owned a manufacturer firm in Rochester, New York, and George Eastman realizes, the potential, of these pre-made plates. At the same time, experiments and successful experiments are being done where the plates are being put on cellulose, on plastic. And George Eastman develops the very famous first camera for the mass, one would say, which of course was the Kodak. And the value of the Kodak, here's the first Kodak, exactly what it looked like. The marketing brilliance, regarding that is that for $25, you could buy the camera. And of course, $25, was a lot of money in 1880. But it came with photo finishing services. So when you bought the camera, it already had a roll of film in the camera that was able to give you 100 pictures. The pictures were circular. They were about 2 by 2. And you would shoot your whole 100 pictures. You would mail it back, ship it back to Rochester, and they would mail it back to you with 100 prints already done and a new roll of film in the camera, all for $25. So it was really, an incredible premise for the middle class, and brought photography in the hands of everyone. And the very famous marketing motto, you press the button, we do the rest. And here's a little picture with a more advanced of a little girl Kodak camera, a better model. And of course, this is one of their original advertisements. See, loaded with 100 pictures, reloading, $2. So we end with this idea of this reality, actually, of George Eastman's Kodak, and the fact that now photography really comes very close to film as we know it. And this wonderful little quote from the Kodak manual, which is really very romantic and very lovely at the same time. Photography is thus brought within reach of every human being who desires to preserve a record of what he sees. Such a photographic notebook, but what a great little phrase, right? Photographic notebook is an enduring record of many things seen only once in a lifetime, and enables the fortunate possessor to go back to the light of his own fireside, to scenes which would otherwise fade from memory and be lost. Great quote to end with. Thank you.